Thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Jenn, for kind of hosting, emceeing also the conversation question part of this. To Samy and Leila, I'm super excited for your performances. This is, I have to say, one of the coolest and most unique things that I've ever gotten to do as a writer with my own writing. And this is just such an incredible thing for me. So basically, the way that this is going to go, the way that we designed this is I have adapted some scenes from the novel that Samy and Leila are going to read. And so we're going to go through those scenes first. Some of them are monologues, one-person scenes. Some of them are together. And then Jenn and I are going to have a conversation, and then we're going to take some questions from you all. So yeah, I'm just really psyched to be here. Thanks, everybody. Should we get started on the performances? Should we move into that? Okay, cool. All right. Brooklyn rooftop, night, present day. Nour, a transmasculine, mixed-race Arab-American, stands at the edge of his teta's apartment rooftop.
Tonight, 5 years to the day since I lost you, 48 white-throated sparrows fall from the sky. Tomorrow, the papers will count and photograph them, arrange them on black garbage bags, and speculate on the causes of the blight. But for now, here on the roof of Teta's apartment building, the sheen of evening rain on the tar paper slicks the soles of my sneakers, and velvet arrows drop one by one from the autumn migration sweeping over Borum Hill. Nothing has stayed the way it was since you died. Not even the way we grieve you. 5 years ago, when your absence stitched Teta's mouth shut for weeks, I hid your collection of feathers, hid the preserved shells of robin's eggs, hid the specimens of bone. Each egg was its own shade of blue. I slipped them into a shoebox under my bed. When you were alive, the warmth of each shell held the thrill of possibility. I first learned to mix paint by matching the smooth turquoise of a heron's egg, aqua, then celadon, then I'd cool the warmth of the cadmium yellow with phthalo blue. When you died, Teta quoted Attar. The self has passed away in the beloved. Tonight, the sparrow's feathers are brush strokes on the dark. Here, I don't have to imagine them in watercolor. The birds clap into cars and crash through skylights, thunk into trash cans, and slice through the branches of ginkgos, and each throat is a star on the canvas of the night. You were the one who taught me to identify sparrows by the yellow patches around their eyes, their black whiskers, or their white throats. You taught me to imitate their calls. Sam Peabody, Peabody, Peabody. There is so much of you, and that is to say myself, that I will never know. Look now, the fog smears the city to blinding. You used to tell me how, for migrating birds, the city's light can kill. Tomorrow, when the ghost of you enters my window with the smell of rain, I will tell you how the birds have never left me. These sparrows are only the most recent in a long chain of moments into which the birds, like you, have intruded. The red-tailed hawks perched on the fire escape above Sahadi's awning, or the female barred owl over Burrow Hill when I come up out of the subway. For all my prayers the night you died, the divine was nowhere to be found. The 48 white-throated sparrows plummeting from the sky tonight are my only companions in grief, the omen that keeps me from leaning out into the air.
Gynecologist's office, Brooklyn. Nour, in a chest binder and paper medical gown, sits on the edge of an OBGYN's examination table, holding a pharmaceutical pamphlet advertising an IUD.
The summer after you died, my periods were the heaviest they'd ever been. I spent rainless evenings standing in fields at sunset, waiting to be raptured into the green flash of twilight, wishing there were another way to exist in the world than to be bodied. It was less than a year since I'd closed my hand around those eggs in the nest, and still I wanted nothing more than to disappear into the weightless womb waiting inside each round, perfect eggshell. that place of possibility where a soul could hum unburdened and unbound. They tell me what my body means, and I am flooded with the urge to return it. I want to slip myself into a different softness. The stems of orchids, maybe. The line of sap running up the trunk of a maple. The fist of a fox's heart. The sun is low when I step outside. At home, Teta will be dozing in her armchair in the silent apartment. I can't stand it. I take the 6 uptown to the Met. You can pay what you want there if you're a New York resident, which makes it the only museum I can still afford. I tell myself a change of scenery would be good, but the columns and vaulted ceilings of the Great Hall make me hate the undignified squeak of my sneakers. I wander off into the Impressionist exhibit, the kind we used to visit in art school, back when I was still painting. Here it is. Representations of the body, from Impressionism to the avant-garde. I stop in front of Degas' toilettes, Cézanne's bathers, Renard's nudes. These women aren't overly posed or idealized, actually, which was considered a provocation at the time. I look for Mary Cassatt or Eva Gonzalez or Berta Morisot, but I don't find them. Instead, I find Gauguin, as always, and the plaques praising his work don't mention the prepubescent girls he had sex with during his time in Tahiti. And Matisse is here too. Here on the plaque for his 1927 odalisque with gray trousers, derived from the Orientalist tradition of the harem, I quote, "I paint odalisques in order to paint the nude," he says. "Otherwise, how is the nude to be painted without being artificial?" Here, my body and the bodies of all the women I know are on the wall as sexualized ciphers for the desires of white men. Once I thought of myself as an artist. I should feel belonging here, but I'm an outsider. I know all the names. I know who will be at the Venice Biennale this year and who will be featured in the contemporary art magazines, but I can't imagine my name listed among them. The last time I saw one of the men I went to art school with, he tried to make me feel better about my artist's block by telling me how few of the women we went to school with are actually painting anymore. I didn't know what to say. I mean, what is there to say, really? It's one thing to have a body. It's another thing to struggle under the menacing weight of its meaning.
A bedroom, Little Syria, 1930s. Leila writes in her diary at a small table by the light of a candle.
Lead was the day I met the woman with the flying machine. My mother would say this isn't a seemly way to begin a journal. But Khaltutala told me I should use these pages to write down the truest things I know of myself. Anyway, since no one else will ever read them, and I can't imagine why anyone would, then I suppose I'm free to say what I really feel, which means I can write to any audience I please, real or imaginary. That's why I'm addressing this to you, B. You're the only one I can imagine reading my secret thoughts over my shoulder. Here, I can call you back into my mind and write the things I'd never dare to say. On the day I began to bleed, I thought I'd grown beyond the age when magic approaches from the corner of one's eye. Playing by myself in the fields, I never did have friends before I knew you. I met a woman who loved winged creatures more than people. There seemed to be nothing strange about this, though our neighbors regarded her as quite the oddity. Her name was Hawa, like the first woman, and she was building a flying machine. They called her Majnuna, you know, but I didn't think she was crazy at all. I went out when my mother was delivering babies and watched Hawa gather her materials. She built the double wings first, then added the wheels and draped the fabric across the body. We never spoke, not until after her flight. That was the day of the blood. I don't know why I didn't tell my mother. She would have been ecstatic, but I was afraid she'd keep me home. Or maybe it was another fear, the fear of what else it might mean, the dread of marriage and what I'd have to learn. I had the feeling that something was ending and would never come again. The whole village came out to watch the spectacle of Hawa's flight, all but my mother, called away by a husband whose wife had gone into labor. A crowd had gathered, a circle with Hawa at its center. Her flying machine was an ungainly contraption with pedals, its wings stretched over broom handles, like a bird crossed with a bicycle. I was the only one who believed she could fly. To me, Hawa's linen wings looked like God's angels. She pedaled hard, gaining ground and speed. I lost sight of her then and ran along behind her until I escaped the crowd. By the time I could see her again, she had reached the crest of a little ridge, and then she was airborne. The crowd stopped taunting her. They whispered prayers and murmured fearful things. Only I followed her, out beyond the last of the houses, tracking her into the fields. Hawa's shadow rushed over me. She hadn't gained much height, but she was in the air. And that, I thought, counted as a miracle. It was because of my faith that I was the only one to witness her death. First, the gust of air, the wings wobbling, dipping, then the linen tore and separated from the wood. She didn't cry out as she fell. She angled her body toward the earth as though she were turning toward the face of an old friend. I didn't have my mother's skill with wounds and setting bones, and we were too far away for anyone to hear me calling for help. Hawa pressed my hand to her chest and told me she had seen things before she hit the earth, visions of wonderful and monstrous things that had been revealed to her. She said she saw dark clouds, rippling flocks of shadows, winged flashes of light. I was disturbed. I asked her, "Madame," I said, "are these visions of blessing or a curse?" She didn't answer me. I closed her eyes. On the way home, I met my mother, returning from the delivery. She was quiet, and I was glad then, because I was sure she'd be angry with me for following Hawa out into the fields. But then the light hit us, and I saw her skirts were spotted with blood. I asked her, like I always did, whether the baby was a little boy or a little girl. When she called me Ya Albi, I knew she was either overjoyed or gravely sad. And I knew without having to ask that neither the mother nor the baby had survived. She never did tell me about the baby. She only said, "The night falls over all of us the same, but also the light, praise God."
Teta's living room, Brooklyn, present day. Teta sits in her armchair, reading, an underscarf on her head and a shawl around her shoulders. Nader sits down across from her and unwraps a manouche, then hands it to her with a napkin, which Teta accepts.
It's from Sahadi's, Teta, your favorite.
قلبك حبيبتي. Hazy today.
Summer in Brooklyn. Teta, did you
They
remember to
raised
take
the
your
price
meds?
one more time, and I cut them in half.
You can't do that, Teta. Come on. Those are your maintenance meds for the myeloma.
About
They're
medicine,
important.
حبيبتي. I kept my mother alive during the French bombardment of Damascus in the spring of 1945. We had to ration her medicine. Worry about yourself, حبيبتي. I know what I am doing.
I know,
The
Teta. I
Kasbara.
know. Teta, you're not. Teta, come back. You're not supposed to go on the fire escape. Come back
I stood
inside.
up to armed men with a bucket of water before you were born.
I already watered the Kasbara, Teta. Come back in. Let's play Tole or, anything that doesn't involve you climbing out a window.
But Teta ignores Nader and continues to water her herb garden on the fire escape.
First winter after you were born, your father, he wanted a tree to celebrate Christmas. Astaghfirullah. He demanded a tree, and I'm the only one home. I carried the tree on my back to surprise them. You remember, eh?
I know, Teta. 20 blocks.
24.
24. Come inside, Teta. Seriously, it's about to rain.
Teta waves the watering can for emphasis.
I took you to Prospect Park so we could walk and walk. 30, 40 blocks. We used to walk and walk until I had my feet like 2 stones. You remember?
Mafi benzene.
To Allah belong the East and the West. So wherever you turn, there is the face of God.
Teta comes back inside, then sets down the watering can and the cilantro with a sigh.
I wish I was as strong as you. Do you want me to do the dusting before dinner? The frame on Mom's Leila Z needs it.
Teta pulls the stems from the kasbara, smelling the leaves.
Ma'alish, leave it. It wasn't so common those days, a woman painter, and to paint with all those details, like a scientist. It was rare, beautiful. Leila's birds.
Mom never really accepted that she was gone.
No, but what can you do? By the time we arrived, she was missing nearly 20 years.
Sometimes I imagine what might have been, if things were different.
Hey.
Teta pauses with the cilantro in her hand.
I was in love once, before your jiddu. There was someone.
A bedroom, Little Syria, 1930s.
B. When I was born, my mother named me Leila, so I would not fear the night. Allah, in his infinite wisdom, she used to say, has created the darkness to remind us that he has given us the light. But in truth, I've always been afraid of the night and the doubt it brings. Little Wing, let me start over. I was born on a sunny day in early March of 1920, the day Emir Faisal declared Syria to be an independent Arab state, in a village not far from Homs. The day I was born, my grandmother took all the flour and ghee from the pantry, went down to the butcher, and had a lamb slaughtered. In the bled, my mother knew everyone. She had delivered every last one of their children. Everyone came and they baked bread and kibbeh and prepared huge trays of sweets while the men drank arak and danced the dabki as though it were a wedding. All this celebration was for our freedom, but my mother always said it went to my head. The new state didn't last 6 months. When the French army took Damascus in July of that same year after a 10-day siege, my father's textile business took a sharp downward turn. I grew up to be a skinny, scab-kneed girl with teeth too large for my mouth, and for years Isa would tease me that I had gnawed my way out of death's grasp, until well into adolescence, when my features had balanced themselves and I had gained some plumpness in my cheeks. Growing up, my mother was the keeper of life and death, but as long as I have known her, she has always also been the loneliest woman I have ever known. My mother used to say her loneliness arrived with the locusts. This was during the Great War, before my parents met, before you were born, Little Wing. They came like a storm and ate every fig to its stem, devoured the bark from every olive tree. And in those days, the Ottomans came to conscript the Christian boys, my mother's brother and father, my uncles, and the neighbors' sons. Between the taxes and the famine that came with the locusts, we had nothing. My grandfather stopped eating. There were more miscarriages than births. Neighbors left for Beirut or Tripoli or vanished into their hunger. And so when news arrived of an Arab uprising against the Ottomans, The village rejoiced. Even my father spoke of joining the revolt. My mother will tell you about the skinny young man he was then, prone to philosophizing, sure, but known more for his lofty political ideas and over-the-top stories than any physical strength. The other boys laughed at him and his promises. But when he vanished one morning, the mothers said he'd finally made good on his promise. He didn't make it out of the province before the sound of warplanes sent him running down a hill to hide in the nearest orchard. The planes passed by and left him unharmed, but he was so afraid that he tripped and fell down the embankment, breaking his leg. After he was returned to the village, word began to spread that he had survived an air raid. And from there, well, you know how stories grow. Soon, the other boys claimed that my father had been attacked by a dozen or more men and had fought them off with his bare hands. They said he'd popped out one of their eyes and kept it like a dried persimmon under his bed. By the time the Arabs took Daraa and then Damascus, my father had become a local hero without ever lifting a weapon. But he made my mother laugh with his absurd tale. And when he asked her to marry him, she said yes. It wasn't until later, when Sultan Pasha al-Atrash declared revolution against France in Jabal ad-Druz, that my father thought again of war. His business was suffering. The French had rained violence on Hama from the air and even cut down Abu Rayyan's orchards. So my father left with a goat hair jacket and a bag of bread and dates, and we did not hear from him for 8 days. But the French brought mercenaries from Morocco and Senegal to quell the uprising, and they surprised the rebels. After 4 days, the revolt was over. Preparations were made to bury the dead. You can imagine that my mother nearly died of shock when the door opened 4 days later and my father fell into the foyer. 2 bullets had grazed him, one on his back and another his ear. He had crawled his way to the nearest house where he'd been lying like a dead man ever since. He'd cheated death a second time, but the season of his political idealism was over, and with it, Hama's revolt. There was a hopelessness everywhere around us in those days that made people whisper again about leaving. Everyone seemed to have relatives who'd gone to America and come back to build houses, or had sons who sent good money home, or a cousin who had come home only to find a bride and return to New York. Why were we here when our sons were reaping their harvests elsewhere? My father said. And that was the moment when I knew. When my father began to talk of abandoning not only his business and his village, but the country he had once been willing to die for. That was when I knew my father had lost all hope. And I thought I had too, until the day after Hawa's death, the day I met you.
A closet full of paintings and prints, wrapped in brown paper. Brooklyn. Nader sits among piles of covered paintings, across from his mother's ghost.
Phalacrorax auritus, double-breasted cormorant. Megascops asio, eastern screech owl. Falco peregrinus, peregrine falcon. Ardea alba, great egret. Corvus brachyrhynchos, American crow. Nyctanassa violacea, yellow-crowned night heron.
All your things are here, just as Teta was keeping them for you when you died. Even as a kid, I understood how much you loved Leila Z's birds. Once, while you were saving up to buy that second aqua tint, the yellow-crowned night heron, I offered you my life savings in an old piggy bank. You refused, of course. But when you got your tenure, not a year before you died, you bought that print to celebrate. People don't really use aqua tint anymore. It creates tone rather than color. The lines create the detail and the depth. Leila Z colored each of her aqua tints by hand. The anatomical details on her prints are hyper-realistic almost. They're surreal. A handful of galleries still show Leila Z's work, the little of it still circulating anyway, since it was all produced back before her disappearance in '46. But being a woman and a naturalist painter, She's pretty much been relegated to history, the quiet, unknown kind. Everyone said she stayed in Little Syria when they demolished it to build the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, but you never believed it. You used to say,
Don't believe them when they tell you who is dead and who is living.
you loved Leila Z long before the campaign to save the old tenement on Washington Street. Since you died, they've reduced it to an empty lot, all weeds. Maybe Leila's activist spirit inspired you, or maybe it was the nest of rare birds living on the tenement's roof.
Geronticus simurgus.
You took the nest as a sign. You added it to your long list of reasons to save the building. You even joined forces with the local masjid to purchase it. You'd save the historical home of this painter you loved. You'd make space for the local Muslim community. You'd save the birds. Looking back, it all seems ridiculous. But with all these reasons popping up like crocuses, you said it
Can't
all
be
a coincidence. You believed God was the remover of obstacles. You used to talk about the future as though it were something we could build for ourselves. You said the birds were an omen. You said,
all things are signs for those who look.
but you read those signs wrong. And I didn't grow up to be a Leila Z. It's true, you fought like my great-great-grandmother, the one who killed scorpions with her bare heels and slit the throats of goats on Eid. You fought to save the neighborhood I'm sneaking into now because I can't paint anywhere but on those walls. But you didn't realize that America has only ever deemed certain histories worth preserving, and beautiful futures are rare for people like us. I tried to emulate your confidence. I tried to believe in everything you loved like it wasn't a fool's errand to believe in justice. You weren't afraid when the death threats came. I still remember that one TV interview you did, the one that preceded the first wave of threats. I knew it was going to be a problem even while you were filming it. At the time, I was convinced that it wasn't the idea of having a masjid there that set people off. It was your conviction and the conviction in your voice when you talked about the birds. Ever since that day, I've been afraid of the knot of shame that was tied in my belly then, the shame of earnest belief. I wanted to shout at you, don't let them see the thing you love. I wanted to cover your mouth. I'd already learned that believing in something for people like us was a punishable crime. And yet, look, you and Leila Z have drawn the same bird here. Two of the same creature that's supposed to not exist.
That was amazing, y'all. I'm cheering up, sorry.
No.
Thank you for your words.
Energy for this wonderful rendition and the beauty of Zeyn's words and the wonderful heart and amazing. Just it's yeah, I'm even wordless too. So Leila and Samy, thank you for this. This was utterly captivating and so beautiful, and I'm so happy to share this virtual space with you all. And
Yeah, thank you both so much.
Thank you. So please give a lot of energy in the chat.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
And I'm so excited that now we get to have a conversation. And Jen and I are friends as well for those who are watching. And so I'm so psyched that we get to have this talk and this time together, even though we're very far away physically.
It's helpful when you actually know each other.
Right. Yeah, totally.
Just like, I know what to avoid.
It's just more fun. I'm trying to like keep my voice down because it's 1:30 in the morning here, but it's going to be very difficult because I'm very excited. So.
Yes. Let's be mindful. So I appreciate your high energy, considering it is a ridiculous hour.
It's light in my face, like middle of the night, fluorescent. We're good.
Great. Oh my goodness. So I am humbled and honored to be here on your launch day, because your book came out today. And for those who haven't, for some reason, gotten this wonderful novel, you see that there is a button below Zeyn and myself that says purchase the 30 Names of Night. And you can do so from Center of Fiction. Thank you again for hosting this wonderful event. Or you're indie. We really encourage indie support here. This is a I love indie books house. So yeah. And please do ask questions. I'll be taking them in about 18 or so minutes or so. Yeah. So my first question, and now that people have been immersed in this world, and again, this wonderful performance from Samy and Leila that is excerpted from your equally wonderful book, I found it so interesting about how you pursued the point of narration, because we are very firm in these two separate timelines, these two separate people who you weave a very intricate thread together. Even the ends of chapters, I notice, really flow into each other. So, and that's a lot of work. That is not easy work. Writing a novel isn't easy work, but viewing multiple POVs, having things connect, having thematic, fluidity as well. I'm wondering about how you pursued this in terms of doing this particular novel, coming from your other novel where you also play with voice and style. So it's not necessarily one cohesive thing. You do put other elements into it as well. So is that something, do you think that's a Zeyn thing? That's going to be Zeyn's thing for novels? Like, I'm going to make it even more complicated every time and multi-POV.
I mean, I think like the multiple POV thing, I don't know for sure if that'll like always be a me thing, but I do think that, I definitely, you're right, with Map of Salt and Stars, I was also doing this thing where I was trying to be really organic about how the two stories were intertwined together. Like I was trying to make the inflection points where the point of view would switch. I was trying to make them based on thematic elements and on what emotions the characters were going through at the point at which they would switch. And so that for the reader would signal that there was an emotional link. And I think that that's also the case here. But I mean, with this story, I was also very much trying to make visible how history reiterates itself on the present, like how our ancestors and elders and just the people that came before us within our, not just our family, but sort of the wider community, that those people are still present with us in so many ways, and that like their lives brought us to where we are now. And so we can think of ourselves as being these sort of independent actors, and that we are making, we're sort of doing whatever we want to do, and that we're free of the weight of history. But that's never really true. And I think I was trying to make that felt,
Yeah. And I know you've had a few conversations prior to the actual release date, which is today. And do you feel like that's come up a little bit, or does it seem really weird? I know, 2020 has been a year. First of all. And when people are saying about these books that are coming out now that have obviously not been written like yesterday, like the process of publishing takes a while, and how prescient everything feels, even more after, we've been isolated and all this stuff, of how everything, like you're saying, when we think about history being past, like, there's this kind of categorization of past is past, present is present, and future future. And it really does all continually blend together. And I don't know if that's come up or people have kind of spotlighted that in conversations about the book thus far. And I know there are more to come.
Yeah, I mean, I think people do have questions about like, why, well, I mean, I think that it's, it takes a while for the reader to sort of realize how the stories are linked. I mean, I don't want to spoil anything here, but I can understand how it's at first it might seem a little bit jarring because the timelines are so different. But what I like about it is that, it's also based on place in a different way than with Map. I mean, here, the character of Nada, who was unnamed until late in the book, is going into this neighborhood and is seeing that this place that was almost completely demolished in 1946 to build the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel. There are 3 buildings left. There's still a little bit left, but like there's still all of this history that, regardless of these huge changes that have taken place, the history is still there. And there is a lot in the story about like, how do you preserve what you can preserve, and when things are not preserved, or when things can't be preserved, whether it's because of construction or gentrification or what have you, in what other ways can history survive, or does it survive anyway? And there's nothing we can really do about that. Like, can we never erase history?
Mm-hmm. And there's an adamant need, as we've seen, to erase it, to try to continue to erase it continually. And it's interesting because you said that it may not be apparent for readers how these two are connected, these two voices, because for a portion of the contemporary voice, they are nameless. So the chapter headers, for those who do have the book, you see the names attached, and at least I was reading on my phone, the ones scratched out for our contemporary reader until they also kind of are able to actually be themselves. And when I was reading this, I felt that very immediately, and that speaks again to your strength as a writer, of there is this holy weight of obligation. And that in itself is kind of a universal story, right? Like, there is the finding of self and there is family obligation. And those two very often do not mesh in a lot of ways, or at least the stuff I'm reading, they don't. Yeah. So when you're starting out, and I don't know if you could speak to if you wrote this book chronologically, if you wrote one voice, if you kind of nailed down the contemporary voice and their plot line, and then kind of brought in the more historical one. If you could talk a little bit about your journey into writing those and kind of finding your way to the end, but also if you knew from the beginning, which may be an unfair question, that they were tied together by something much deeper than what we end up finding out as readers.
Yeah, I mean, this book went through so many iterations over the last 3-4 years. And I knew, I think from a pretty early point, that I had this story of this, what I thought of it at the time as a family, in more of like a literal way. And I knew that I wanted to talk about like queer history in some way, but it was very unclear in the beginning. And originally, like in the very first draft, I was like, I can't talk about trans people. Like I can't have a non-binary hero. Like I didn't know how I would, not that I didn't know how I would do it. I knew how I would do it, but I wasn't out myself. And so there was a lot of fear about that. And it was only in around like the second, third draft that I was like, okay, I'm going to do this. And coincided also with my decision that I wanted to go ahead and transition, and I wanted to be out, and that I didn't really have a choice, that for my own ability to thrive, not just survive, that I really needed to do that. And so when I was writing the story, I did go through chronologically-ish, I would say. I kind of wrote in chunks where I would have like the piece of Leila's introducing herself in her first chapter, which is the second chapter of the book, like came out as this gigantic chunk. And what's in the book is actually very condensed. And I knew for another sections that I wanted him to find some relic of her, or something that he could use as sort of, that becomes like a key to read the things that she's not saying too. Because what becomes apparent over the course of the book is that there's a theme about what is said, but also what is not said. And what is not said for safety and survival's sake too. You know, the things that can't be said, or the things that are crossed out. And so like that also, I didn't figure out until much later, like a much later draft of the book, how I wanted to handle Nader as a narrator in terms of scribbling out the name, just because even though there is a huge, you know, tradition of like anonymous or nameless narrators in, you know, the Western literary canon, still I knew that there was going to be this, you know, this desire in the reader for the dead name, for the birth name, for something to call this person. And I didn't want to give it to them. And I knew that, but I also just knew that I guess in some way I tried to put myself into the shoes of Nader himself. And I said, you know, if I was this character, like if this character were real, or if this were a book somebody wrote about me, or they took my journals or whatever, what would I do? Like if I saw this and I saw my dead name, I would probably scribble it out, you know? And I just at some point thought, well, then that's what he should do. Like that's a realistic reaction, right? And so what happens, and I ended up loving this, that he takes back his power by scribbling out his name, his birth name, his dead name, until he has given himself enough time to find a name that he chooses for himself. And so it becomes this counter erasure where like the dead name would be erasing him. And so he erases it. And in doing that, he gets to draw attention to the harmfulness of the desire for that name. And he also gets to take back his power and say, no, I don't have to have all the information now. I'm going to take my time.
So I want to tap into the chat. Your mom says she's very proud of you.
Thank you,
Someone
Mom.
else complimented your jacket. And Samy said, thank you for not dead naming Nadir, because it feels very important. And why does it matter? So yeah, I want to tap into that to get that chat energy.
Yeah. I mean, I think I feel like that too, like even as an author, you know, it's hard because like my dead name, my birth name came out on my first book jacket for my debut, you know? And so even though now all the like English language versions of my work, and almost all of the translations have my new actual name on them, they have Zeyn on them, people will still dead name me. And there's not really any reason to now, you know? And so like, on the one hand, I can understand because it was this public thing, but it's also very difficult. And so, you know, I think that like, we can't always control how we're going to be talked about. However, I do think that this character for me was a lesson in, you know, we may not, even in those moments, we may not have all of the power to prevent all of the kinds of oppression that we face. How can we use the tools that we do have, even just to use our silence as an act of resistance?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of love in this book. You're like, these characters are surrounded by people who really do care about them. And caring and loving, as we know, does not prevent someone from doing harm, as you mentioned. And that felt, it felt very poignant to me, and it shows whenever I'm reading characters, especially underrepresented characters in work, it feels incredibly important to make sure that they're housed in a place of love, and that love can be from many entities, or it can be from a single entity that we have consistent access to within the work itself. And it felt like for both people that we're following, that is such a consistent thing, but there is still that fear. It is a valid fear, absolutely. And it comes from other entities as well as within those spaces. So when building their lives respectively, like in conjunction with each other for the story, but really isolated for the telling, how did you envision that? And can you speak to that? Well, I feel like I should ask if you can speak to that, because I know it's not always easy to be able to kind of articulate these areas of story building itself. But you know, the Teta relationship and the main character, I'm hesitating using their name, even though you said their name, because I'm like, wait until you find out and the name's been said.
No, it's cool. It's on the jacket.
It's a fun reveal. It's a really nice reveal when I was looking through the TOC. You know, and the poignancy and the beauty of that relationship is really a tether for so much. But, you know, like with their sister, you know, and you know, their other friends and how their community is so full with people who understand them, but are still trying to understand the contemporary character. And for Leila, people who don't understand, who don't really know, because she's hidden a lot as well. Yeah, how did you feel like you wanted to approach that, or did you see them pretty organically come into play as you were writing?
I mean, I knew that I wanted to have like a variety of reactions. However, I think that there are a lot of depictions out there of, you know, trans people and queer people coming out and being met with violence and being met with rejection, and like that's a narrative that we're all familiar with. And of course that happens, and, you know, we have to honor that, absolutely. And there's a place for that. And I've written about that in other various kinds of work. But I think in this particular work, I just really, really wanted to see, which I've also seen in my own life, you know, at various points, the times when people surprise you, you know, the times when somebody, an elder in your family, let's say, that you thought, or someone you look up to, you know, that you thought, oh, this person, for sure, they're going to reject me when I come out. There's no way. And you never know. And I think that like, that is a thing that gets overlooked a lot when we talk about coming out as a process, that like, of course we have to be safe, and we have to do what we have to do to stay safe, and to come out to the people that we trust, and to not, you know, put ourselves in harm's way. And no one can make those decisions for us. However, you know, one of my experiences, among the many that I have had since I came out, it's been several years now, was that people consistently surprised me. Sometimes it was a negative surprise, but a lot of the time it was a positive surprise, you know, and that you find that sometimes you have allies where you didn't know that you had them, or you find out like, oh, you know, you're not the only queer person or trans person even in your family, you know, whether it's like, I mean, it could be anyone, and maybe they don't come out, or, you know, maybe it's just a feeling, or maybe it's an elder and they don't have the language that you have to talk about it. You know, a lot of this book is also about that kind of intergenerational difference with language. And I wanted like the truth of those kinds of relationships to also be on the page, because I don't think we get to see that very often. And there is a lot of joy in it.
Yeah, yeah. I really reveled in that. In I don't know if safety is the right word so much, but a feeling, you know, very much trusting your hand as an author of what you are bringing me into, and the beauty of your writing in general, but also the world that you're building, and the genuine care you're putting into these characters is something to be very much commended, because it's beautiful. It's just like, it's stunning. It's absolutely stunning. So
thank you.
I see we do have a question, so I do want to make sure to preface, because I have many questions, because I prepared.
Awesome.
But we're going to take a question. Are there other works you read with multiple narrators that influenced your work? And Kim, love the birds in your work, by the way. From
Thank
Detroit.
you, Kim. Let's see. Yeah, well, you know, there's a couple of different sources of inspiration for that. One of the big ones is just oral storytelling traditions in Southwest Asia and North Africa, in Arab culture. There's a big tradition of telling stories that are interwoven with different threads and different narrators, and stories that reflect on each other. I mean, I use that a lot as inspiration for The Map of Salt and Stars, where the historical thread was much older than the contemporary thread by like 800 years. Makes this look a lot, you know, more recent, but and I think one author in particular that I think does this really well, that when I read his work, I was blown away, is Rabia al-Madin, who wrote The Hakawati, who wrote An Unnecessary Woman, The Angel of History is one of my favorites. And he also does a lot with like weaving history into the present, or weaving like fabulism in with contemporary reality. And I think, you know, he's definitely one of the authors that has shown me that like some of the limits of what I thought, you sort of could do, what was outside the rules just don't apply, but there's just so many other people that are doing that, but that's for sure, he's one of them.
Mm-hmm. I want to tap into, because some of what was performed were areas I did highlight, and that's very handy when you have this thing on your app. And there's one specific one that I just really loved, and it's from chapter 8 from Leila. My mother's back and mine were made from the same mold. Our spines were fashioned for bearing and bending and bowing and burying. Great alliteration, by the way. Our backs have been honed over generations for the thankless labor of women. They had never been made for wings. And how wings and flight, like the metaphor, the symbolism, all this beauty of it, it's very interesting about how that actually comes to play, because it makes this even more unique. And I'm not a nature person, I'm a city person. You know this about me. You know this about me, Zeyn. Stuff not being open late is a hardship.
True.
And I'm so curious how the birds come into play, because you do something also that's so magnificent, and it's very hard to be consistent with, is sensory. You have such rich sensory details with smells, the sights, the textures, like all of it is very well woven through both POVs. And from the contemporary one, they're in New York, I'm in New York. So it's just like, yep, know that. I definitely know that. You know what I mean? But for that line, it was just so beautiful, because, it brings back in the wings, and it actually opened me up more to the kind of symbolism that you were bringing into with the birds and all that stuff. So can you talk a little bit about how the birds came into play? And if that was ever cognizant, even when you're kind of writing these beautiful lines that you're talking, like I like, this is a great point where I can kind of refer to flight or being grounded, or to, like the beauty of texture and identity and, categorization and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was the reason that birds are so woven in is because they were such a symbol of memory on one hand, even just the memory of land being something that remembers things. And also that they are such a symbol of the search for the divine and the sacred that, so often queer and trans people are denied the opportunity to see themselves as sacred or see their lives as sacred. And there's definitely, for me, a lot of this book is about history, access to one's history, being a prerequisite, if you will, for being able to imagine your future. I think if you deny somebody history, it makes it very difficult to envision what life might be like if they don't know how they got here. And that's true for so many groups, not by any means just the groups that are represented in this novel. And so for Nader, like a lot of the way that I think about Nader in this book is that, in a way, he's trying to find a way where he can imagine himself into being, where he can even see his embodiment and his existence the way that he wants to, the way that he already exists in some way, where he can imagine that as a possibility. Because for a lot of the world, the message he's getting is that he's not a possibility, that he's not supposed to exist. And so in a way, he is the rare bird. And that's what Nader means, is rare. He is the rare bird that he wants to exist, that he needs to know exists. And I think that's true for a lot of the characters, and so when the birds do come in, it is often as a symbol of that kind of searching for a possibility, trying to figure out and unearth the history of how we got here and the people that came before you, and knowing that you're not alone and that you're not the first to walk on a given path, in order to imagine the possibility of the future that you're trying to build.
Sorry, I have like a fire truck in the background, which is very New York.
That's real. That happens.
Not now. So my last question for you, because we're hitting the hour mark, and if someone has a question, chime in, please do. We want to hear from all of you. Do you feel like, and again, this may be an unfair question, without this kind of journey, this kind of seeking out for Leila Z for the contemporary character, that they might have made this journey at this time, or that it might have taken a bit longer, or that it may have kind of segued into something different? Because it does feel like this is their truth, and they need to be true to themselves, essentially. That there's just like there's no other way to say it. And I understand, like in the literary sense, we have the inciting incident, and that's what kind of propels the narrative itself. And I'm curious if you feel like, as author or just as person who loves these characters as much as you do, that for this contemporary character, if Leila Z had not been part of this, that this story might have kind of woven to them to be able to reach that place at this time.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I guess in a way, one of the things you're getting at is like, what do we do when the historical record is lacking? Because that's another part of it, right? That like a lot of the time, queerness and transness, among many other things, is just erased, or it's coded in a way that's really hard to read. Whether that's because the person who was writing it just couldn't say it, or because someone else erased it. And so I think that when you're faced with that, you have to read between the lines. And I think my feeling on how to answer this is maybe that's one approach this character could have taken if the device of Leila Z of the past sort of reaching for the future, trying to imagine a future. If we didn't have that, there's always the possibility to try to imagine that history, right? To try to restore what was lost through imagining it, which, not to get too meta, but like that's kind of what I feel like I did as a novelist, right? Like that's one of the beautiful things that I have the opportunity to do, is I have the opportunity to reach back and be like, well, what if? Because we know that people were there. We know that there were people. Maybe we don't know exactly who they were, or exactly the specific things that happened to them, or all of the story, but we know that there was a story.
And so, yeah, now that y'all know this, we're getting towards the end. Now y'all have questions, don't you? We're going to do lightning round, Zeyn, because I know it's late over there, so I don't want to keep you up anymore. So,
should I take? Here is one, I see.
Yeah, there's three.
Oh, there's three.
Well, there's
okay.
There's two. There's two relevant ones, but there's one. So DC of Lorinda's Toledo's. Thank you for this question, by the way. I appreciate how you drew on the traditions of your culture in crafting this story. Curious to what extent you had to uncover those traditions through research, or whether they were passed down to you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think, it's partially both. I mean, I think that you can have a sense of something based on conversations, or based on just the ways that people interact with stories in general, and you can sort of take that and run with that. And then there's also, of course, like, just because you have that doesn't mean you don't need to do research to sort of flesh things out, or figure out, I know I've had this kind of story told to me, but like the mechanics of doing it, I mean, that's the kind of thing where I have to go learn that, right? So I guess a little bit of both, the best answer.
And the next one, Samantha, what is your advice for novice writers trying to tell difficult and non-traditional stories? And I think we know what non-traditional means.
Yeah,
I think us BIPOC know what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, best advice, just try not to write for the dominant gaze. I mean, I think it's tempting always. Like, there's always that pressure for sure. But like, if you're writing for you, and you're writing for, or you're writing for like, maybe one or two really close people that you trust with the story that you're telling, where you don't feel like you have to explain, I think that's a good place to start usually, is try to imagine that you're telling the story to somebody to whom you would not have to like explain every little thing. Because not only is that bad for the story usually, but it's also bad for you as a storyteller, because it teaches you to sort of devalue your own voice and not trust yourself and not trust your instincts. And that's ultimately how we grow, I think, as writers a lot of the time, is trying to hone that instinct for how do I tell stories? Not how does somebody else tell stories or how am I supposed to tell stories, but how do I tell stories?
That's great advice. Thank you for that. And thank you all for being here. I know an hour goes by fast when you're having some good times, and it's emotionally jarring, and like all the tears are happening, But please do, if you have not yet gotten the 30 Names of Night, you can purchase it now from Center for Fiction or your local indie. Please support the indies. We love them so much, and we want them to survive all this. And thank you again, Samy and Leila, for the beautiful, 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 beautiful performances. Yes, I said it 5 times because it needed to be said 5 times.
Beautifully.
And Zeyn, happy Pub Day. Huge hugs. Thank you for being here with us late at night. And thank you for this fantastic book. I mean, it is teachable. It is loving. It is wonderful. Your words and your sentences are just absolutely phenomenal, and I just read them over and over and just fall in love all over again. So thank you for this.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you so much, everybody. Samy and Leila, you're amazing. And yeah, thanks everybody for being with us. Thank you to the Center for Fiction for having me. This was such a pleasure.